white cop confronts black judge at courthouse, but what she does next is shocking. Judge Naomi Carter pulled her car up to the side entrance of the New Orleans courthouse, her heart pounding as she glanced at the clock on her dashboard. 10 minutes until trial. She sighed, running a hand over her temple, willing herself to focus. Today was no ordinary trial. It was the beginning of a case that could reshape racial profiling laws in Louisiana. This wasn't just another day in court. This was personal. The defendant, Marcus Ellis, was a young black man arrested in his own neighborhood for looking suspicious. He had been waiting for a rideshare when Officer Adam Reynolds approached him, demanded identification, and without cause, forced him to the ground and handcuffed him. The excuse? He fit the description. Naomi had seen cases like this before, too many to count, but this one had gained national attention. Today, she would preside over the trial, and the stakes were higher than ever. Wanting to avoid the mob of reporters at the main entrance, Naomi chose the side door. As she strode across the lot, her heels clicking against the pavement, she instinctively reached for her courthouse ID badge, preparing to present it at security like she did every morning. But before she could reach the door, a voice stopped her. "Ma'am, hold up." She turned to see a young white officer standing guard, his stance stiff, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Officer Adam Reynolds. His gaze traveled up and down, assessing her. Naomi, used to these looks, felt the familiar wave of frustration bubble inside her, but she kept her face impassive. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked evenly, holding up her badge. "I'm Judge Carter. I'm presiding over a case this morning." Reynolds barely glanced at her ID before narrowing his eyes. "I'm going to need you to answer a few questions first." Naomi felt a chill crawl up her spine. This was happening again. She inhaled deeply, willing herself to remain calm. "What's the issue?" "There was an incident nearby," Reynolds said, his hand hovering near his belt. "You match the description of someone involved." Naomi's pulse quickened. Match the description? She had heard those words too many times, words used as a weak justification for targeting black people who didn't belong. Here she was, a judge, on the morning of a racial profiling case, being racially profiled at the courthouse door. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need to get inside. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes. She held up her ID again, hoping this time he would actually read it. But Reynolds didn't budge. Instead, he took a step closer, his posture rigid. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am." His tone was sharper now. "You need to come with me." Naomi's breath hitched. She recognized that look in his eyes. The same look she had seen growing up in the South, the same undeniable mix of authority, suspicion, and contempt. This wasn't about security. It was about power. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Naomi turned to see a familiar face, Sergeant David Lawson, a seasoned black officer with years of experience under his belt. His eyes flicked between Naomi and Reynolds, his expression quickly shifting from curiosity to concern. "Judge Carter?" Lawson's eyebrows lifted as he recognized her. Naomi nodded. "Good morning, Sergeant." Lawson's gaze snapped to Reynolds, his jaw tightening. "Stand down." Reynolds hesitated, clearly frustrated. "She matches the description," he muttered. Lawson's face darkened. "That's the judge." His voice was sharper now. "Do you want to lose your job today, Reynolds?" The young officer finally backed off, though the tension in his posture didn't fade. Naomi exhaled slowly, willing her hands to stop trembling. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Lawson asked, his voice softer now. Naomi nodded, though her jaw remained tight. "I'm fine." She turned toward the courthouse door, not sparing Reynolds another glance. She stepped inside, the sterile halls welcoming her with a sense of normalcy. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling curling in her stomach. This wasn't an isolated incident. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, yet even she wasn't immune to the very prejudice she was working to dismantle. And the irony? She was about to preside over a trial on racial profiling, after experiencing it firsthand just minutes before walking into court. Judge Naomi Carter settled into her chair at the bench, her hands resting on the smooth wooden surface as she surveyed the packed courtroom. The murmurs of anticipation, the shifting of bodies in stiff wooden seats, the clicking of pens from reporters, it all blended into a familiar hum. But today, Everything felt different. She was still reeling from what had happened outside. Stopped, questioned, nearly detained, all because a young white officer had seen her race before her authority. And now, sitting before her, was Marcus Ellis, a young black man on trial for no crime other than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Naomi took a slow, measured breath and banged her gavel, calling the courtroom to order. We will begin opening statements. The prosecution, led by Samantha Green, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for dismantling weak defenses, stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice measured but firm. "This case is about more than one wrongful arrest. It is about a pattern of injustice that has gone unchecked for too long." Naomi observed the jury's reaction. Some leaned forward, hanging on to every word. Others sat back, arms crossed, skepticism etched into their expressions. This wasn't just another trial to them. This was a statement. Samantha continued, detailing how Marcus had been stopped without cause, searched without a warrant, and detained without justification. How the officer, Adam Reynolds, had assumed guilt first and asked questions later. Mr. Ellis was standing on a street corner, waiting for a rideshare, Samantha emphasized. That is all. And yet, he was treated like a criminal, thrown to the ground, handcuffed, humiliated in front of his own neighbors. Naomi's grip on her gavel tightened. She remembered the way Reynolds had looked at her outside, the same way he had looked at Marcus. The defense attorney, Richard Lawson, rose next. He was smooth, confident, one of those lawyers who could talk his way out of anything. "The officer in question," Richard said, "was simply doing his job. Given recent reports of crime in the area, his actions were justified. He had reasonable suspicion." Naomi raised an eyebrow, resisting the urge to scoff. Reasonable suspicion? The phrase had become a shield for racial profiling, an excuse to harass people who didn't look like they belonged. Marcus sat stiffly at the defense table, his face unreadable. Naomi could only imagine what it felt like to sit there, hearing yourself described as a threat, when all you had done was exist in the wrong space. The first witness was called, Marcus Ellis himself. Naomi leaned forward slightly, observing him as he took the stand. He was young, early 20s, with deep brown eyes that carried the weight of too many unjust experiences. He adjusted his tie nervously, swallowing before speaking. "Tell us what happened that night, Marcus," Samantha prompted gently. Marcus exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the witness stand as if steadying himself. "I was just waiting for my Uber," he said, his voice quieter than expected. "I had just left my friend's house. I was checking my phone when I saw the police car pull up." Naomi noted the way his shoulders tensed as he spoke. "Then what happened?" "The officer got out, told me to put my hands up." "Did he explain why?" Marcus shook his head. "No, he just asked me what I was doing there, where I was going. I told him I was heading home, but he didn't believe me. He said I looked nervous, like I was up to something." Naomi's stomach churned. The words mirrored her own experience outside the courthouse. "Then what?" Samantha pressed. Marcus hesitated. Naomi could see him wrestling with the memory, with the humiliation of having to relive it in front of a room full of strangers. "He told me to turn around. When I asked why, he said I was resisting." His jaw clenched. "I wasn't resisting. I was just confused." Before I could say anything else, he grabbed me, shoved me against the car, and put me in cuffs. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Naomi let it settle for a moment before banging her gavel. "Order." She turned her gaze toward Officer Adam Reynolds, who sat at the defense table. His expression was unreadable now, his earlier smugness replaced with a discomfort that suggested he understood, for the first time, that he had made a mistake. When it was time for the defense's cross-examination, Richard Lawson approached the stand, his demeanor polished. "Mr. Ellis, you said you looked at your phone. Would you say you were looking around nervously?" Marcus frowned. "No, I was just checking my texts." "But you admit you looked around?" "Yes, but not because I was doing anything wrong." Lawson nodded slowly. "Can you see how an officer might perceive that as suspicious behavior?" Naomi nearly rolled her eyes. This was how these cases always went, twisting reality, planting doubt in the jury's mind, making it seem as if Marcus had done something wrong simply by existing. Marcus clenched his jaw. "No, because I wasn't doing anything wrong." The courtroom hummed with tension. Naomi tapped her fingers against the gavel, her mind drifting to her own encounter with Reynolds just hours ago. How quickly had she gone from being a highly respected judge to someone who matched a description? She glanced toward the jury, wondering if they saw the truth yet. This wasn't just about Marcus. This was about a system that had been allowed to operate this way for far too long. The tension in the courtroom grew heavier as the prosecution called its next witness. Naomi Carter kept her face impassive, but her fingers tensed against her gavel. "The prosecution calls Officer Adam Reynolds to the stand," Samantha Green announced. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Naomi's chest tightened as she watched Reynolds rise from the defense table. The same man who had tried to detain her outside the courthouse just hours ago was now taking the stand as a witness in a case that mirrored the very crime he had nearly committed. He adjusted his uniform, squared his shoulders, and walked stiffly toward the witness stand, his expression a poor imitation of confidence. He looked everywhere except toward Judge Carter. Naomi took note of it. He was nervous. Good. Once seated, he placed his right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Naomi doubted he even understood the gravity of those words. Samantha wasted no time. "Officer Reynolds, can you walk us through the events of the night in question?" Reynolds cleared his throat. "I was on patrol in the neighborhood. We had reports of recent break-ins, so I was keeping an eye out for suspicious activity." Naomi's jaw tightened. She knew where this was going. "And when you saw Mr. Ellis, what made you approach him?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. He was standing on the corner, looking around. It seemed like he was watching the area. He fit the description of a suspect in a previous break-in. There it was. Naomi saw Marcus stiffen at the defense table, his hands curling into fists beneath the table. She knew what that phrase meant. Fit the description. It was an excuse. A catch-all justification for harassing black men and treating them as criminals first, citizens second. Samantha tilted her head. "Officer Reynolds, you said Mr. Ellis looked around. Can you explain why that was suspicious?" Reynolds hesitated. "He seemed nervous." "Nervous?" He nodded. "Yes, he kept checking his phone, looking up, checking his surroundings." "Isn't that typical behavior for someone waiting for a ride?" Samantha pressed. Reynolds stammered. Well, maybe, but I didn't know that at the time." "Did you ask him if he was waiting for a ride before ordering him to turn around and putting him in handcuffs?" Reynolds shifted in his seat. "No." The jury sat up a little straighter. Naomi watched closely. He was unraveling, and he knew it. Samantha moved forward. "So, to clarify, you saw a man standing on a corner waiting for a ride. You didn't ask him what he was doing. You didn't confirm whether he was a suspect, but you handcuffed him anyway?" Reynolds' face reddened. "I was acting on my best judgment." Samantha's eyes hardened. "Your best judgment, which led to an innocent man being arrested, humiliated, and treated as a criminal without cause." Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. A heavy silence settled over the room. Naomi knew this was a critical moment. The jury wasn't just hearing the case, they were feeling it. They were seeing how quickly assumptions could ruin a life. But Naomi wasn't done watching Reynolds squirm. She leaned forward slightly, fixing him with the same calm yet cutting gaze she had used from the bench countless times. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice smooth but firm, "are you aware of what happened outside this courthouse this morning?" The color drained from his face. He hesitated. I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor." "You stopped me at the courthouse entrance today," Naomi continued, her voice measured. "You demanded my identification. When I told you I was Judge Carter, you didn't believe me. You assumed I was a threat." The courtroom was silent. Samantha's eyes flickered with interest, and the jury leaned in. Reynolds swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Naomi let the silence stretch, let it sit heavy on his shoulders. "Tell me, Officer Reynolds," she continued, "would you say you acted on your best judgment then too?" His hands clenched in his lap. He knew there was no right answer. Naomi didn't blink. She didn't need him to answer. She already knew. And now, so did everyone else. The weight of Officer Reynolds' silence hung over the courtroom like a thick fog. The jury had seen it. The cracks in his story, the realization creeping into his face as he understood the consequences of his actions. But this case was never just about him. Naomi Carter knew that this trial wasn't just about Marcus Ellis. It was about the larger pattern, a system that gave officers like Reynolds the power to act on bias without consequences. A system that allowed people like Marcus to be treated as criminals before they even spoke a word. As Reynolds stepped down from the stand, his shoulders slumped. Naomi took a moment to glance at Marcus. His eyes were fixed on the table in front of him, as if forcing himself not to react. He had lived this. He had felt it, suffered through it, and now he had to relive it again for the sake of proving what he already knew: he had done nothing wrong. The prosecution called its next witness, Sergeant David Harrison, Reynolds' commanding officer. The veteran officer took the stand, adjusting his posture in a way that spoke of decades in law enforcement. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short, his uniform pristine, his face stoic. But Naomi could tell he was uncomfortable. Samantha Green wasted no time. "Sergeant Harrison, how many times has Officer Reynolds detained someone who turned out to be innocent?" Harrison hesitated. "I don't have that exact number." "More than once?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Yes." "More than 5 times?" His fingers tightened around the arms of the witness chair. "Yes." The air in the courtroom grew denser. Naomi could feel it, the shift happening. The jury wasn't just hearing about one bad arrest anymore. They were seeing the pattern unfold in real time. Samantha pressed forward. "Would you say Officer Reynolds has a pattern of stopping individuals based on race?" Harrison hesitated. He knew what was being asked of him. To admit the truth was to admit fault in his department, to acknowledge the system's failure. His lips pressed into a tight line. "I can't say for certain." "Can't say or won't say?" Harrison exhaled, his hands flexing in his lap. "I won't deny that some officers rely on certain instinctual profiling methods, but we always strive for fairness." Naomi almost scoffed. She had heard this defense before. Instinctual profiling. A polite way of saying racial bias was just part of the job. But the jury wasn't buying it. Naomi could see it in their faces, the flickers of realization, the quiet anger growing in their expressions. This wasn't about one officer's mistake. This was about a system that trained them to make those mistakes again and again. Naomi Carter knew that this was the moment the case would hinge on. The prosecution had laid out the facts, piece by piece, like constructing an unshakable foundation. The testimony of Officer Reynolds had revealed his lack of justifiable cause for stopping Marcus Ellis, and Sergeant Harrison's reluctant admissions had exposed the systemic problem. But what would happen next? The cross-examination of Reynolds by Marcus's defense attorney, Daniel Hayes, would decide everything. Hayes was known for his methodical, yet ruthless approach. He wasn't the type to raise his voice or grandstand. His strength lay in making witnesses reveal their own contradictions. As he approached the stand where Reynolds sat, his presence alone shifted the air in the courtroom. "Officer Reynolds, let's go back to the night in question." Hayes's voice was calm, steady. "You said you saw Mr. Ellis and thought he looked out of place in the neighborhood?" Reynolds shifted slightly in his seat. "That's correct." Hayes nodded. "Define out of place." Reynolds blinked. "I mean, he didn't look like he belonged there." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Naomi caught the slight stiffening in the jurors' shoulders. "And what does someone who belongs there look like?" Hayes's tone sharpened ever so slightly. Reynolds hesitated. He knew what was being asked of him, and the weight of the moment was crushing him. "Well," he stammered, "I just mean, he wasn't someone I'd seen in the neighborhood before." Hayes didn't let up. "And how many times have you stopped a white man in that neighborhood simply because you hadn't seen him before?" Silence. Naomi could see the sweat forming at Reynolds' temple. He swallowed, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. I don't recall." "You don't recall, or it hasn't happened?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "I don't recall." Hayes turned toward the jury, letting the weight of the moment settle before pivoting. "You claim that Mr. Ellis was acting nervous. Is that correct?" Reynolds nodded quickly. "Yes, he kept looking around like he was about to run." Hayes arched an eyebrow. "You stopped him because he was looking around?" "It wasn't just that," Reynolds insisted. "He was loitering, standing at the same spot for several minutes." Hayes sighed, as if disappointed. Officer Reynolds, are you aware that Mr. Ellis was waiting for a rideshare? The jury perked up at that. Reynolds shifted again. I wasn't at the time, no. Hayes nodded, pacing slightly. So let's summarize. You stopped Mr. Ellis because he was standing in one place, because he looked nervous, which, by the way, is a completely subjective judgment, and because you hadn't seen him in that neighborhood before. And when you stopped him, did he attempt to flee? Did he resist? Reynolds swallowed again. No. Did he raise his voice, become aggressive, make threats? No. Hayes turned to the jury once more, his face serious but calm. So in essence, Mr. Ellis's only crime that night was being a black man in a neighborhood you didn't think he belonged in? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Reynolds' face burned red. He shifted, opening his mouth as if to argue. But he had nothing to say. Naomi could feel the atmosphere tighten. The jurors had been following the case closely, but now they weren't just listening. They were understanding. Marcus Ellis sat still, watching, his hands clenched in his lap. Naomi could tell he wanted to speak, wanted to shout, but this moment wasn't about his anger. It was about the truth finally being laid bare. Then Hayes went for the final blow. Officer Reynolds, do you regret stopping Mr. Ellis that night? Reynolds hesitated, looking around. His commanding officer, Sergeant Harrison, was watching from the gallery. Naomi recognized the flicker of panic in Reynolds' eyes. He had never expected to be here, had never thought his decision that night would come back to haunt him in this way. Finally, he cleared his throat. Yes, gasps swept through the room. Hayes nodded, stepping back. No further questions, Your Honor? Naomi let out a slow breath. This was it. This was the turning point. Truth had spoken louder than excuses, and there was no going back. The courtroom had quieted, but the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Naomi Carter remained seated at the bench, watching the expressions of those around her. The jurors seemed deep in thought, processing the contradictions in Officer Reynolds' testimony. Marcus Ellis sat with his attorney, his hands folded in his lap, his face unreadable, but his eyes carrying the weight of years of injustice finally being acknowledged. And then there was Bill Reynolds. The officer had shrunk in his seat, his once confident posture now tense and uncertain. Naomi had seen many witnesses unravel under questioning, but this was different. This wasn't just a mistake, a lapse in memory, or a simple miscalculation. This was an admission, unspoken but clear. Then, just when she thought the proceedings were over, Reynolds did something unexpected. He shifted forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, may I say something? Naomi raised an eyebrow. A courtroom was not the place for unsolicited personal statements, but something in his voice, something raw, something almost desperate, made her pause. She gave him a slow nod. Proceed. Reynolds swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked not at his attorney, not at the jury, but at Marcus Ellis. I was wrong, he said, his voice quiet, almost as if the words pained him. I thought I was doing my job, but I see now that I made assumptions that I shouldn't have. I see now how that must have felt for you. A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. A murmur spread across the gallery, but Naomi lifted her hand to silence the room. Marcus's lawyer, Daniel Hayes, turned toward his client, searching his face for a reaction. But Marcus remained still, his expression unreadable. And I'm sorry, Reynolds continued, his voice almost trembling. I can't change what I did. I can't take back how I treated you, but I just needed to say that. Naomi studied him. Was this genuine regret, or was this a last-ditch effort to save face? Marcus finally shifted in his seat, his eyes locked on Reynolds. He didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch. Then finally he said, I hear you. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement. Naomi exhaled slowly, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. This wasn't just about one man's apology. This was about the system that had allowed these biases to thrive for so long. The fight for justice was far from over, but this was a step forward. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Naomi Carter remained seated at the bench, her thoughts heavy. The case had ended, but the struggle for justice was far from over. Marcus Ellis had received a verdict that affirmed his innocence, but how many others had been unjustly targeted, with no cameras, no courtroom full of witnesses, no judge willing to hear their truth? She thought about Officer Bill Reynolds' unexpected apology. It was a start, But an apology didn't erase years of systemic discrimination. It didn't bring back the time Marcus had lost. It didn't change the fear so many lived with every day. Real change required action, not just regret. As Naomi gathered her files, she glanced toward the courtroom door where Marcus stood with his attorney. He caught her gaze and gave a small, solemn nod. A silent exchange passed between them, a mutual understanding that this was only the beginning. Justice wasn't just about verdicts. It was about ensuring that cases like this became the exception, not the rule. Naomi knew her work was far from done, but as she stepped down from the bench, she carried with her a renewed sense of purpose, because the fight for justice was one she would never abandon. Life has a way of testing our values, especially when faced with injustice. Judge Naomi Carter's story is a reminder that integrity is not just about knowing what is right, but having the courage to act on it. Justice is not guaranteed. It must be fought for, case by case, moment by moment. Too often, power is misused, and assumptions take the place of fairness, leaving innocent people to suffer under a system that should protect them. For those who have lived long enough, this truth is not new. Many have witnessed unfairness, seen history repeat itself, and perhaps even experienced the sting of discrimination firsthand. But change is possible, and it starts with accountability. Whether in a courtroom, a workplace, or our daily interactions, we must demand fairness, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. True justice is not about punishing the guilty alone. It is about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of race, status, or background. At any age, we can be part of that change, by speaking up, by voting wisely, by mentoring the next generation. Because justice should not be a privilege, it should be a promise.